The black woman's wrists were bound by cold metal handcuffs, faced with public humiliation. "People like you don't belong in first class anyway," Officer Reynolds sneered, loud enough for everyone nearby to hear. His badge gleamed under the bright airport lights as he tightened the handcuffs one notch further than necessary. Vanessa Williams, Harvard-educated attorney, philanthropist, and humanitarian, looked directly into Officer Reynolds' eyes without a hint of fear. All around her, airport travelers stopped to stare, many raising their phones to record what was unfolding. Reynolds tightened the handcuffs one notch beyond necessary, a small, petty cruelty meant to assert dominance, to inflict discomfort without leaving evidence. "Officer," Vanessa said, her voice steady and clear, "you're making a mistake you'll regret very soon." Reynolds laughed. Another cop with a power trip. This was another black woman he thought he could intimidate. But he had no idea who she really was. He couldn't have known that the woman he was treating like a criminal was more than just a black woman. He couldn't have known that his career was about to implode, all because he chose the wrong passenger to insult, the wrong woman to handcuff, and the wrong day to let his prejudice overrule his judgment. But now, he was about to find out. Before we dive into the story, if you believe everyone should be treated with fairness and respect, like and click on the subscribe button and tell us where you're watching from in the comments, because what happens next in this story will leave you speechless. Before she was standing handcuffed in an airport terminal, Vanessa Williams was simply going about her morning routine. At 32, she carried herself with the quiet confidence of someone who knew exactly who she was and what she had overcome. That crisp autumn morning, in her elegant but understated home in the suburbs, Vanessa prepared for her humanitarian journey to Sudan. The sunlight streamed through tall windows as she carefully packed medical supplies into her carry-on. These were antibiotics that would treat infections in children who might otherwise die. She carried vaccines that would protect entire communities, and specialized equipment that smaller medical outposts in Sudan desperately needed but couldn't afford. She was on a mission to help the less privileged. As she finished packing, her phone rang with the special ringtone she'd assigned to Malcolm, her husband. The screen lit up with a photo of them together in Rwanda last year. 10 years of marriage, and he still looked at her the same way he did when they were college students, with nothing but dreams and determination. Malcolm Williams, the same man who had started as a baggage handler at O'Hare Airport at age 19, working grueling shifts while putting himself through night school. The same Malcolm who had mortgaged everything they owned to lease a single plane and launch what would become Skyline Airlines. He had identified underserved routes to smaller cities, gradually building a regional carrier into the country's fourth largest airline with over 300 aircraft and 15,000 employees. "All set for your flight?" Malcolm asked, his deep voice carrying the fatigue of his early morning meetings. "Just about," Vanessa replied, smiling at the sound of him. "The medical supplies are all packed. This delivery should help hundreds of children at the camp. The director says they've been without basic antibiotics for almost a month." "I wish I could join you this time," Malcolm said with genuine regret. "The board meeting couldn't be rescheduled, and the Paris route expansion needs final approval." "Someone has to keep the airline running," Vanessa laughed, no resentment in her voice. "Besides, you'll be there for the school opening next month. That's the more joyful occasion anyway." "I've arranged for Daniel to meet you before your connecting flight," Malcolm added, referring to Skyline's Paris station manager. "He'll make sure the medical supplies transfer smoothly." "You don't have to do that," Vanessa said, though she appreciated his thoughtfulness. "I can handle a connection like everyone else." "I know you can," Malcolm replied, "but I don't want you to experience any delay at all. Besides, Daniel insisted when he heard you were coming through. This was the reality of being married to Malcolm Williams. While Vanessa preferred to travel without special treatment, word inevitably spread among Skyline top employees. They were the only ones who knew her as the billionaire's wife and treated her with particular care as their boss's wife. Vanessa had never been one to flaunt her status or connections. Despite being married to an airline CEO, she often flew commercial, sometimes even economy. She believed in experiencing the world as others did, in understanding the systems she hoped to improve. Today, though, she had a first-class ticket, a rare concession to the long international flight ahead and the important work awaiting her arrival. The car Malcolm had arranged, not a limousine but a modest sedan with a trusted driver they'd known for years, arrived promptly. Vanessa double-checked her passport and vaccination records, tucked her foundation identification into her purse, and took a deep breath, centering herself for the journey ahead. As the car approached the busy international terminal, sunlight glinting off the glass and steel structure, Vanessa felt the familiar mix of excitement and anxiety that preceded every humanitarian trip. The lives that would be changed, the challenging conditions ahead, the purpose that drove her forward. What she couldn't have known was that her greatest challenge wouldn't be in a refugee camp in Sudan. It would be right here, in an American airport, at the hands of an officer who would take one look at her and see not a billionaire's wife or humanitarian, but simply a black woman he believed didn't belong in first class. Have you ever been discriminated against by an authority just because of how you looked and their prejudice? Share your thoughts in the comments and click on the subscribe button to enjoy this story more. The moment Vanessa Williams stepped into the vast international terminal, the subtle shift began. At the Skyline Airlines check-in counter, Vanessa presented her passport and confirmation for her first-class ticket to Paris, connecting to Khartoum. The agent glanced at her, then back at the computer screen, a flicker of doubt crossing his face. "First class to Paris?" he questioned, emphasizing the words as if they were an unlikely combination. "Are you certain about that booking?" Vanessa had encountered this before. The subtle implication that there must be some mistake, that the well-dressed black woman standing before them couldn't possibly have legitimately purchased a premium ticket. "Yes, I'm certain," she responded calmly, sliding her confirmation across the counter. "Seat 2A. The agent's fingers tapped across the keyboard, his expression still skeptical. "And how will you be paying for any additional baggage fees or in-flight purchases?" "I won't have any extra baggage," Vanessa replied. "Everything is within the first-class allowance." Another passenger, a white businessman in a rumpled suit, approached the adjacent counter. The same agent's colleague greeted him warmly. "Good morning, sir. Flying to London today? Let's get you checked in quickly so you can relax in the lounge." No questions about his ticket class. No implication that he didn't belong. After finally receiving her boarding pass, Vanessa made her way towards security. That's when she first noticed him, Officer James Reynolds. At 45, he carried himself with the swagger of someone who enjoyed the power his uniform provided. Reynolds stood at the entrance to the security lanes, directing passengers. "A white family with small children, express lane, right this way. A group of business travelers, priority screening to your left." An elderly Asian couple looking confused, his voice rising with impatience. "Regular screening, that way." Vanessa observed as Reynolds directed every white passenger with a priority boarding pass to the expedited screening lane. When a Hispanic man in a business suit presented his first-class boarding pass, Reynolds scrutinized it carefully before reluctantly waving him through. With her first-class ticket and priority access, Vanessa approached the expedited screening lane. Reynolds immediately stepped into her path. "Regular screening is that way, ma'am," he said firmly, pointing toward the longer line where the wait appeared to be at least 30 minutes. I have priority access, Vanessa replied politely, showing her boarding pass. First class. Reynolds didn't even glance at the document. We need to verify that. Please step aside. Verify what exactly? Vanessa asked, her voice still composed but firm. My boarding pass clearly shows priority access. Ma'am, I decide who needs verification. That's my job. Step aside or you'll be delaying other passengers. Vanessa stood her ground, noticing that a small crowd was beginning to observe the interaction. Officer, I've noticed that you've allowed every other passenger with priority access through without verification. I'm simply requesting equal treatment. Reynolds' face hardened. Are you accusing me of something? I'm making an observation, Vanessa replied calmly. A white woman in her 50s with a supervisor badge approached. Karen Matthews, the terminal operations supervisor, alerted by another officer about the potential situation. Is there a problem here? Matthews asked, her eyes darting between Reynolds and Vanessa. I'd like to report what appears to be discriminatory treatment, Vanessa said. I've been denied access to the priority lane despite having a first-class ticket, while others with identical documentation have been allowed through without question. Matthews barely looked at Vanessa's boarding pass. Officer Reynolds is following security protocols. Some passengers are selected for additional verification based on security algorithms. And what algorithms would those be? Vanessa asked. Karen shifted uncomfortably. I'm not at liberty to discuss security procedures, but I can assure you, it's random selection. Random? Vanessa replied, her eyebrow raised slightly. I've been observing for 10 minutes, and the pattern doesn't appear random at all. Ma'am, questioning security procedures can itself be flagged as suspicious behavior, Karen said, her tone carrying a warning. Reynolds seemed pleased by the supervisor's tacit support. You've been selected for additional screening. Step this way. As Vanessa was led to a separate area, she noticed other travelers watching. Some with sympathy, others averting their eyes, the universal response of those who witness injustice but prefer not to get involved. The additional screening area was set apart, visible to other travelers. The humiliation public by design. Reynolds snapped on blue latex gloves with deliberate slowness. Open your carry-on, he ordered. As Vanessa complied, he began removing items one by one, examining each with exaggerated scrutiny. When he reached the medical supplies, his eyebrows raised. That's a lot of medication, he commented. What are these for? They're donations for a refugee camp in Sudan, Vanessa explained. I have all the proper documentation and import permissions. Reynolds barely glanced at the papers she offered. Seems like a lot of trouble to go through. Most people just enjoy their vacations without all this baggage. It's not a vacation, Vanessa corrected him. It's humanitarian work. Reynolds smirked as he continued his search. Humanitarian work? In a first-class seat? That seems wasteful. The comment was designed to sting, to imply that Vanessa's presence in first class was somehow fraudulent or inappropriate. My travel arrangements aren't relevant to security screening, Vanessa replied, her patience being tested but her composure intact. Reynolds continued his invasive search, now examining her personal items with inappropriate thoroughness. Designer luggage, first-class ticket, humanitarian work. Interesting combination. He held up her boarding pass, examining it again with theatrical suspicion. These first-class tickets cost thousands. Interesting career in, what did you call it? Humanitarianism? The implication was clear. He didn't believe someone like her could legitimately afford such a ticket. The comment lingered in the air, heard by nearby passengers and other officers. Vanessa took a deep breath, centering herself before responding. Officer Reynolds, she said, noting his name badge for the first time, I understand you have a job to do. But your comments about my appearance, my ticket class, and my profession are inappropriate and irrelevant to security procedures." Reynolds' face flushed with anger at being directly challenged. "I decide what's relevant to security, ma'am," he said, his voice hardening. "And right now, your attitude is becoming a concern." It was the moment the professional tension transformed into something personal. The moment Officer Reynolds decided that this well-spoken black woman needed to be taught a lesson about questioning his authority. Reynolds continued his inspection of Vanessa's carry-on with deliberate slowness, stretching what should have been a 5-minute procedure into an ordeal approaching 20 minutes. Each item was removed, examined, and set aside with theatrical suspicion. The medical supplies, clearly labeled and professionally packaged, received particular scrutiny. "What exactly are these?" Reynolds demanded, holding up a box of antibiotics. "As I've explained twice now, those are amoxicillin donations for the refugee camp medical center," Vanessa replied, her voice steady despite her growing frustration. "The documentation is right there in the clear folder." Reynolds barely glanced at the paperwork. "Pretty expensive medications. Who's paying for all this?" "The Williams Foundation," Vanessa answered. "We partner with pharmaceutical companies for donations." "We?" Reynolds questioned with a smirk. "So you work for this foundation?" "I'm the co-founder and executive director," Vanessa clarified. Reynolds let out a dismissive chuckle. "Executive director flying first class to deliver medications? Seems like those donations could go further if you flew coach. Or is that beneath you?" The comment hung in the air. The first openly disparaging remark, designed to humiliate rather than investigate. Several nearby passengers shifted uncomfortably, recognizing the comment for what it was. "My travel arrangements are irrelevant to security screening," Vanessa stated firmly. "I'd appreciate it if you would focus on legitimate security concerns rather than making judgments about my flight class." Reynolds' expression hardened at being directly challenged. He moved closer, intentionally invading Vanessa's personal space. "You know what I've noticed in 15 years doing this job?" he said, voice lowered but still audible to those nearby. "First class is usually for people who can afford it. Not people like you." The words landed like a physical blow. There it was, the naked prejudice behind the random screening. Not about security at all, but about a black woman in a space where Officer Reynolds believed she didn't belong. A collective intake of breath from observers confirmed the line had been crossed. Even in 2025, such blatant discrimination was shocking when witnessed in broad daylight. Vanessa's composure wavered for just a moment before she gathered herself. "I'd like to speak to your supervisor immediately," she stated, her voice clear and unwavering. "My supervisor is busy," Reynolds replied dismissively. "Then I'd like to speak to their supervisor." Vanessa persisted. "Your comment was inappropriate and discriminatory." Reynolds' face flushed with anger. "You're becoming disruptive, ma'am. Interfering with security procedures is a federal offense." The threat was clear. Comply and accept the humiliation, or face escalating consequences. Vanessa looked directly at Reynolds, measuring her response carefully. "I understand security procedures, Officer Reynolds. I also understand my rights as a traveler. Your personal comments about my appearance and assumptions about my economic status are not part of legitimate security protocols." "You don't belong here," he shouted. "You people always think you know your rights," Reynolds said, abandoning all pretense of professional conduct. "Always ready to play the victim card when you're just being asked to follow the same rules as everyone else." "You people?" Vanessa repeated, the phrase hanging in the air like a toxic cloud. Reynolds realized his mistake too late. The mask had slipped completely now. Rather than backtrack, he doubled down. "You heard me," he said, voice rising. Entitled people who don't know their place, making everything about race when it's about attitude. Your attitude is the problem here. Karen Matthews, the supervisor who had earlier dismissed Vanessa's concerns, stood at the periphery, clearly aware of the escalating situation but making no move to intervene. Vanessa spotted her and called out, "Miss Matthews, I need to speak with you about Officer Reynolds' conduct." Matthews pretended not to hear, turning away to speak with another employee. Reynolds, emboldened by his supervisor's tacit approval, stepped closer to Vanessa. "You know what happens to difficult passengers?" he said, voice dripping with condescension. "They miss their flights. Security concerns can take hours to resolve, sometimes days. Sometimes they end up on no-fly lists." It was no longer about security. It was about punishment for questioning authority, for refusing to accept humiliation quietly. "Are you threatening to prevent me from boarding my flight because I questioned your discriminatory treatment?" Vanessa asked, each word precise and measured. Reynolds smiled, a cold expression devoid of humor. "I'm explaining the consequences of continued non-compliance and disruptive behavior." With calculated deliberation, he began repacking Vanessa's belongings, mixing items together, disorganizing the carefully arranged medical supplies. "Oops," he said with false concern as he accidentally knocked over a container of medications. Security can be messy sometimes. It was the pettiest form of power, the ability to create inconvenience without consequence, to punish through 1,000 small humiliations. For Vanessa, it was the moment of decision. She had endured the discriminatory treatment, the inappropriate comments, the disregard for her rights, all while maintaining her composure. But watching the vital medical supplies being deliberately mishandled crossed a line. Those weren't just her possessions. They represented life-saving treatments for vulnerable children. "I need those medications to remain organized and intact," she said firmly. "They're properly labeled for distribution at the medical camp." "Should have thought about that before you decided to be difficult," Reynolds replied. "Maybe next time you'll show proper respect for the process." The public humiliation was reaching its crescendo. Reynolds' voice had gradually increased in volume, ensuring that everyone nearby could witness Vanessa's treatment. It was a display of dominance, the officer putting the uppity black woman in her place. Several passengers looked away, uncomfortable but unwilling to intervene. A few continued recording, documenting the abuse of power unfolding before them. Then Reynolds made his fatal miscalculation. "In fact," he said, hand moving to his handcuffs, "your increasingly agitated behavior is concerning me. You're exhibiting signs of potential threat." "I'm standing perfectly still and speaking calmly," Vanessa pointed out. "How exactly am I threatening you?" Reynolds' expression darkened. "That tone, those questions, the way you're standing, in my professional assessment, you're becoming aggressive." The fabrication was transparent, creating a narrative of threat where none existed, laying groundwork for escalation from harassment to arrest. "Are you seriously suggesting that asking questions about discriminatory treatment constitutes aggression?" Vanessa asked, disbelief evident in her voice. "There you go again. Questioning my authority," Reynolds said, unclipping his handcuffs. "Turn around and place your hands behind your back." The moment crystallized with perfect clarity. Reynolds had crossed the line from harassment to false arrest, from discrimination to abuse of power. There was no security concern, no legitimate reason for detention. Just a man with a badge punishing a woman who refused to accept mistreatment quietly. Have you ever witnessed where someone experienced discrimination disguised as procedure or policy? Tell us the story in the comments below and hit that subscribe button now to see what happens when Officer Reynolds discovers exactly who he's been insulting and how his attempt to humiliate Vanessa Williams will become the biggest mistake of his career. Vanessa had made a decision. Reaching slowly into her purse, she removed her phone. "Before you place me under arrest on fabricated charges, I'd like to make one phone call," she said, her voice calm but resolute. "This isn't a TV show," Reynolds mocked. "You don't get a phone call until you're at the station." "Actually," Vanessa replied, "as I haven't been formally arrested yet, I retain my full rights as a citizen. One call, then you can proceed with whatever action you deem appropriate." Something in her tone, the absolute certainty, the lack of fear, gave Reynolds pause. Still, his ego wouldn't allow him to back down, especially with an audience watching. "Go ahead," he said with a dismissive wave. "Call your lawyer. Won't change the fact that you're about to miss your flight and spend the night in a cell." With deliberate calmness, Vanessa dialed a number she knew by heart. When the call connected, she spoke clearly, her voice carrying to those nearby. "Malcolm, it's me. I need you at Terminal B, International Departures, Security Checkpoint 7. Officer James Reynolds is attempting to arrest me on fabricated charges." "No, I'm fine. I've remained completely calm. Yes, there are witnesses and recordings. I understand. I'll see you soon." Reynolds rolled his eyes, clearly unimpressed by what he assumed was a bluff. "Husband coming to the rescue? How touching. Maybe he can visit you in the holding cell." What Officer James Reynolds couldn't possibly know was that the man on the other end of that call wasn't just any concerned husband. He was Malcolm Williams, founder and CEO of Skyline Airlines, the very company whose terminal they were standing in. The man whose quiet philanthropy and profound influence extended through every level of the aviation industry, from baggage handlers to board members. The man who at that very moment was ending a meeting with the governor to rush to his wife's side. Officer Reynolds had just made the most consequential mistake of his career. He had chosen, out of all the passengers he could have harassed that day, the one person with the power not just to end his career, but to transform the entire system that had protected him for 15 years. Officer James Reynolds had made his decision. The woman standing before him would be arrested, her dignity stripped away, her flight missed, her humanitarian mission delayed. All because she had questioned his authority, had refused to accept discriminatory treatment with quiet submission. "Vanessa Williams, you're under arrest for disorderly conduct and obstruction of security procedures," Reynolds announced loudly, ensuring everyone nearby could hear. "Turn around and place your hands behind your back." The collective gasp from onlookers was audible. The escalation from harassment to arrest seemed shocking, even to those who had witnessed the entire confrontation. Vanessa's face betrayed no fear, no panic, just a profound disappointment in the system. With measured movements, she turned and placed her hands behind her back, maintaining her composure even as the cold metal of handcuffs closed around her wrists. Reynolds tightened the handcuffs one notch beyond necessary. A small, petty cruelty meant to assert dominance, to inflict discomfort without leaving evidence. It was the kind of technique passed down through generations of officers who understood how to punish while staying just within the boundaries of what could be defended later. "See where your attitude got you?" Reynolds taunted, loud enough for nearby travelers to hear. "Now you'll miss your fancy first-class flight. Maybe next time you'll show proper respect to airport security." As he spoke, he made a show of roughly gathering Vanessa's scattered belongings, carelessly shoving the medical supplies into her bag with deliberate disregard for their organization or fragility. The message was clear. Her mission, her purpose, her dignity were all irrelevant in the face of his authority. "Those supplies are for refugee children," Vanessa stated calmly, watching as months of careful planning and collection were undone in moments of spiteful disregard. "Should have thought about those refugee kids before you decided to be difficult," Reynolds replied with a smirk. "Actions have consequences, ma'am." By now, at least 20 passengers had formed a loose circle around the scene, many openly recording with their phones. The videos captured what Reynolds seemed oblivious to: the stark contrast between Vanessa's dignified calm and his increasingly aggressive behavior. The footage showed no signs of the disorderly conduct he had claimed, no evidence of obstruction or threat, just a woman standing perfectly still while being handcuffed and taunted. "This is wrong. She didn't do anything," called out one passenger, a middle-aged woman clutching her boarding pass. "Mind your own business unless you want to join her." Reynolds snapped back, his hand moving instinctively to his weapon. A threatening gesture caught on multiple cameras. Among the gathering crowd stood Jamie Ortiz, a 25-year-old customer service representative for Skyline Airlines. Unlike the other airport employees who looked away or pretended not to notice, Jamie stepped forward, Skyline ID badge prominently displayed. "Officer Reynolds," Jamie said, voice shaking slightly but determined, "I've been observing this entire interaction as part of my customer service duties." Miss Williams has remained calm and cooperative throughout. This appears to be a violation of both airport security protocols and Skyline's passenger rights policies. Reynolds turned to Jamie, eyes narrowing dangerously. "Get back to your counter before you lose your job, kid. This is official police business, not customer service." "I'm required to report any potential passenger rights violations," Jamie persisted, standing ground despite visible nervousness. "And my supervisor would want to know about this situation immediately." "Your supervisor can take it up with me later," Reynolds said dismissively. "Right now, you're interfering with an arrest. Last warning, back off or you're next." The threat hung in the air, naked intimidation of a witness attempting to intervene. Jamie hesitated, courage warring with self-preservation. Vanessa, still handcuffed but remarkably composed, caught Jamie's eye. "It's all right," she said quietly. "Thank you for speaking up, but please don't risk your position. This will be resolved soon." Jamie stepped back reluctantly but remained nearby, continuing to observe and document the situation. Reynolds grabbed Vanessa's arm to lead her away, his grip unnecessarily tight, another small cruelty designed to demonstrate control without leaving marks. But as he moved to lead Vanessa away, something unusual began happening around them. The airport's atmosphere shifted subtly at first, then with increasing momentum. A call came through on Karen Matthews' radio. She listened, her face draining of color. A moment later, her phone rang. She answered, listening intently before her eyes widened in shock. "Yes, sir." "Immediately, sir." "I understand the severity." "Yes, I'll handle it personally." Across the terminal, other supervisors were receiving similar calls. Security personnel spoke urgently into their radios. Customer service managers huddled in concerned groups, glancing repeatedly toward the confrontation. Even Reynolds, focused as he was on Vanessa, began to sense that something unusual was happening. Airport employees were moving with increased urgency. Radios crackled with coded communications. Managers appeared from offices, their expressions grave. Karen Matthews approached, her earlier dismissive attitude replaced by barely concealed panic. "Officer Reynolds," she said, her voice tight with anxiety, "I need to speak with you immediately." "Not now, Karen," Reynolds replied impatiently. "I'm in the middle of an arrest." "James, this is serious," Matthews insisted, using his first name for the first time. "You need to pause this procedure immediately. Unless you want to join her for obstruction, back off," Reynolds snapped. "I know what I'm doing." Matthews' phone rang again. She answered, her hand visibly trembling. "Yes, sir. He's still proceeding. Yes, I understand. He's refusing to." "Yes, sir, immediately." She turned back to Reynolds, genuine fear now evident in her expression. "James, release her. Now, this is coming from the highest level." Reynolds scoffed, his ego still blinding him to the shifting dynamics. "The highest level? What did the airport director call you?" "I don't answer to administrative staff, Karen," I answer to the police department. James, please, Matthews pleaded, now desperate. You don't understand what's happening. Just trust me and remove those handcuffs. The commotion had attracted the attention of Lieutenant Davis, Reynolds' direct supervisor, who approached rapidly from across the terminal. His face was a mask of professional concern hiding unmistakable alarm. Reynolds, he called out sharply. Stand down immediately. Reynolds turned, confusion finally breaking through his arrogance. Lieutenant Davis rarely appeared in the terminal unless something significant had occurred. Lieutenant, I'm handling a disruptive passenger who... Remove those handcuffs now, Davis interrupted, his tone leaving no room for argument. That's a direct order. But sir, I've already initiated the arrest process. She was interfering with security procedures and... Now, Reynolds. Davis's voice carried an urgency Reynolds had never heard before. And pray to God it's not too late. Bewildered but compliant, Reynolds produced the key and removed the handcuffs from Vanessa's wrists. She rubbed them gently, the only acknowledgement of the discomfort she had endured. Lieutenant Davis turned to Vanessa, his demeanor transformed to one of profound professional respect. Ms. Williams, I extend my deepest apologies for this incident. Your husband is arriving now. Reynolds looked between them in growing confusion. Her husband? Who the hell is her husband? The lieutenant's expression was a mixture of disbelief and dread. You didn't check her ID thoroughly, did you? You didn't recognize the name Williams? Williams is a common name, Reynolds replied defensively. What does her husband have to do with anything? Before the lieutenant could answer, a commotion near the terminal entrance drew everyone's attention. Airport security staff were creating a path through the crowded terminal. The airport director himself had appeared, straightening his tie nervously. Reynolds watched in growing apprehension as the crowd parted. Something was very wrong. The confident certainty that had fueled his actions minutes ago began to crumble, replaced by the first tendrils of genuine fear. Lieutenant, he asked, voice lowered, who exactly is her husband? Lieutenant Davis looked at Reynolds with a mixture of pity and anger. Malcolm Williams, he said simply, as if the name alone should explain everything. Reynolds shook his head, still not comprehending. Am I supposed to know who that is? The lieutenant gestured toward the windows overlooking the airfield, where dozens of aircraft bore the distinctive Skyline Airlines logo. Beyond them stood the corporate headquarters building, the name Williams visible even at this distance. Malcolm Williams, the lieutenant repeated slowly, founder and CEO of Skyline Airlines. The company that employs half the people in this terminal. The man who sits on the airport authority board. The airline owner whose name is on your daughter's college scholarship program. As understanding finally dawned on Reynolds' face, the lieutenant leaned closer, his voice a harsh whisper. You just handcuffed, insulted, and attempted to falsely arrest the wife of the most powerful man in this airport. And the cameras caught every second of it. Reynolds' face drained of color as the full implications hit him. The swagger, the arrogance, the certainty all vanished in an instant, replaced by the sickening realization of what he had done, and who he had done it to. It wasn't just a career-ending mistake. It was a life-altering miscalculation that would strip away everything he had built over 15 years. His authority, his reputation, his financial security, all because he couldn't resist the urge to put a black woman in her place. And as Malcolm Williams entered the terminal, flanked by airline executives and legal counsel, Officer James Reynolds finally understood the true meaning of consequences. The atmosphere in Terminal B shifted palpably as Malcolm Williams entered. At 45, he carried himself with the quiet confidence of someone who had nothing to prove, the bearing of a man who had risen from baggage handler to airline CEO through sheer determination and vision. He wasn't a large man physically, but his presence commanded attention, radiating an authority that needed no badge or uniform to enforce. Behind him walked 4 people in impeccable suits. Skyline's chief legal counsel and executive team. Their expressions were professionally neutral, but their purposeful stride matched their CEO's resolute pace. Airport Director Robert Chen, who minutes earlier had been in a budget meeting, now rushed across the terminal, perspiration visible on his forehead despite the building's careful climate control. "Mr. Williams," Chen called out, slightly breathless. "I've just been informed of the situation. I want to assure you, we're taking this extremely seriously." Malcolm barely acknowledged Chen, his eyes scanning the terminal until he located Vanessa. The subtle tightening of his jaw was the only indication of the controlled fury he felt, seeing the marks on his wife's wrists where the handcuffs had been. As Malcolm approached, Officer Reynolds stood frozen, the color drained from his face. The dawning horror of his situation was written in his eyes, the gradual, sickening realization that 15 years of unchecked power had led him to this catastrophic miscalculation. Karen Matthews hovered nearby, her earlier dismissiveness replaced by desperate damage control. "Mr. Williams, I want to personally apologize for this unfortunate misunderstanding. We have the highest respect for Mrs. Williams and the Foundation's work. I didn't know who Ms. Williams was. If I had known." "If you had known it was my wife," Malcolm interrupted, his voice measured but carrying an undercurrent of steel, "would that have changed how you responded? Because that's precisely the problem, isn't it? The selective application of respect based on perceived status." Karen fell silent, unable to counter the truth in his words. Malcolm reached Vanessa, gently taking her hands and examining the red marks on her wrists. "Are you all right?" "I'm fine," she assured him, her composure still remarkable despite what she'd endured. "Just concerned about the medical supplies." Officer Reynolds was less than careful with them. For those watching, it might have seemed an odd priority to worry about medications rather than her own treatment. But it spoke volumes about Vanessa's character, about the mission that had brought her to the airport in the first place. Malcolm turned to face Reynolds, who seemed to physically shrink under his gaze. "You're Officer Reynolds?" Malcolm asked, though it wasn't really a question. "Yes, sir," Reynolds managed, his earlier swagger completely evaporated. "You just attempted to arrest my wife on fabricated charges." Reynolds swallowed hard. "Sir, I'm really sorry. It was a mistake and misunderstanding. There was a security protocol that—" "What security protocol involves telling a passenger that people like her don't belong in first class?" Malcolm interrupted, his voice dangerously quiet. "What protocol involves handcuffing a calm, cooperative traveler for questioning discriminatory treatment?" Reynolds had no answer. The true magnitude of the situation was beginning to ripple through the terminal. Longtime airport employees recognized Malcolm Williams. And now, in a stunning twist of fate, the husband of the woman Officer Reynolds had chosen to humiliate. For those unfamiliar with the Williams story, it seemed like a scene from a movie, the powerful CEO rushing to defend his wronged wife. But the reality was even more remarkable. Malcolm and Vanessa had met in college. He working nights as a baggage handler to pay tuition, she on academic scholarship but taking jobs at the library and cafeteria to cover living expenses. Both from working class backgrounds, both driven by dreams bigger than their circumstances. While Vanessa excelled in law school, Malcolm worked his way up from baggage handler to flight operations, learning every aspect of the airline business from the ground up. When he identified underserved regional routes that major carriers ignored, he mortgaged everything they owned to lease a single plane. Skyline Airlines began with that one aircraft and 6 employees, including Malcolm, as both CEO and occasional pilot. Vanessa continued practicing law, but devoted evenings and weekends to helping build the fledgling airline, reviewing contracts, negotiating landing rights, establishing the legal framework that would support their growth. Over 15 years, through recessions, fuel crises, and industry consolidation, Skyline expanded methodically. Malcolm's operational expertise and Vanessa's legal acumen proved a formidable combination. When larger carriers failed or contracted, Skyline acquired their routes, their aircraft, sometimes their entire regional operations. Unlike many companies that grew through cutthroat tactics, Skyline built a reputation for treating employees fairly. The baggage handler turned CEO never forgot where he came from. When other airlines slashed benefits, Skyline protected them. When competitors outsourced jobs, Skyline kept them in-house, building loyalty that translated to customer service. The Williams Foundation grew alongside the airline, initially funding scholarships for employees' children, later expanding to international humanitarian work. Vanessa eventually left her law firm to lead the foundation full-time, bringing the same strategic thinking to philanthropy that had helped build the airline. Now, that same couple stood in Terminal B. Vanessa with the marks of handcuffs still visible on her wrists, Malcolm facing the officer responsible with controlled fury. "Here's what happens next," Malcolm stated, his tone making it clear this wasn't a negotiation. "We'll review the security footage from the entire incident. We'll take statements from witnesses. We'll examine Officer Reynolds' record for previous complaints of discriminatory behavior." Skyline's chief legal counsel stepped forward, tablet in hand. "We've already accessed the security feeds, Mr. Williams. The footage clearly shows Officer Reynolds allowing white passengers with priority access through expedited screening while diverting passengers of color for verification. It also shows Miss Williams remaining completely calm throughout the interaction, contradicting any claim of disorderly conduct. Lieutenant Davis, Reynolds' supervisor, looked increasingly grim. "We'll conduct a full internal investigation, Mr. Williams. Officer Reynolds is suspended effective immediately pending the outcome." "An internal investigation isn't sufficient," Malcolm replied. "This goes beyond one incident or one officer. This is about systemic practices that have apparently been tolerated for years." Airport Director Chen inserted himself into the conversation, desperate to contain the situation. "Mr. Williams, I assure you we take these allegations extremely seriously. Perhaps we could discuss this privately in my office?" "There's nothing to discuss privately," Malcolm responded. "My wife was publicly humiliated. Any resolution will be equally public." Officer Reynolds stood alone, his world collapsing around him. 15 years of unchecked authority, of small cruelties justified as security procedures, of complaints dismissed and behavior excused, all undone in 30 minutes because he chose the wrong passenger to target. His face registered the full realization of what awaited him: suspension, investigation, possibly criminal charges for false arrest, certainly civil rights violation complaints. The professional consequences were devastating enough, but the public humiliation might be worse. To be forever known as the officer who handcuffed an airline owner's wife out of pure prejudice. "You're fired immediately," Malcolm stated boldly, turning to Reynolds, who was shaking already with tears rolling down his cheeks. "How would his wife and children feed if he has no job?" he muttered to himself. At this point, his tears was rolling all down and he couldn't help but beg for his job. Vanessa looked at him with compassion and turned to her husband for mercy, for a suspension rather than firing him. Vanessa, who had remained silent during this exchange, finally spoke. "If I may," she said, her voice drawing everyone's attention, "I'd like to address what happened today, not just as an individual incident, but as a symptom of a larger problem." All eyes turned to her. The woman who, minutes earlier, had been handcuffed and threatened with arrest, now commanding the space with quiet authority. "What happened to me today happens to travelers of color every day," she continued. "The difference is, most don't have the resources or connections to fight back. Most suffer these indignities in silence, missing flights, losing money, enduring humiliation because the system is designed to leave them powerless." "What exactly are you proposing?" Lieutenant Davis asked cautiously. "Immediate implementation of body cameras for all airport security personnel," Vanessa answered without hesitation. "Mandatory anti-bias training conducted by independent experts, not internal departments. A transparent complaint process that doesn't automatically favor officers over civilians, and consequences for supervisors who enable discriminatory behavior." She glanced meaningfully at Karen Matthews, who looked away. "These aren't controversial requests," Vanessa continued. "They're basic protections to ensure that power is exercised fairly." Malcolm nodded in agreement. "Skyline Airlines carries 40% of this airport's passenger traffic. If these changes aren't implemented, we're prepared to reconsider our hub operations here." The implications of such a move were staggering, potentially catastrophic for the airport's finances and the regional economy. It wasn't an idle threat, and everyone present knew it. Airport Director Chen paled visibly. "We can begin implementing these measures immediately, Mr. Williams. I'll convene an emergency meeting of airport security leadership this afternoon." As the leadership group moved toward the director's office to formalize the agreements, Malcolm noticed Jamie Ortiz, the young employee who had tried to intervene on Vanessa's behalf. "You're the staff member who spoke up?" he asked. Jamie nodded nervously. "Yes, sir." "Jamie Ortiz, customer service representative. Thank you for having the courage to do the right thing despite the risk," Malcolm said, genuine appreciation in his voice. "That's the kind of integrity Skyline values." Jamie straightened, a smile breaking through the anxiety. "Thank you, sir." All because he couldn't resist the urge to put a black woman in her place, only to discover too late that her place was far higher than he could have imagined. 6 months later, the international terminal looked different now. Body cameras were standard equipment for all security personnel. Signs in multiple languages informed travelers of their rights and the procedure for filing complaints. Security staff reflected the diversity of the traveling public they served. Officer James Reynolds was no longer stationed at the checkpoint. After a 3-month suspension, he had been required to complete extensive retraining, including 200 hours of community service with the Williams Foundation's domestic programs. Rather than returning to his previous role, he had requested transfer to the department's newly formed Community Relations Division, where he now worked to build trust between security personnel and minority communities. The system-wide changes extended beyond this single airport. Malcolm Williams had leveraged Skyline's influence to push for standardized anti-discrimination protocols across all airports where the airline operated. The Respect in Travel initiative had become a case study in corporate responsibility, using economic leverage to drive social change. Vanessa Williams continued her humanitarian work, but added a new focus, using the Foundation's resources to document and address discrimination in public spaces. The educational materials developed from her experience were now part of training programs for security personnel nationwide. On this particular morning, Vanessa once again approached the security checkpoint for her flight to Paris, connecting to another humanitarian mission. The difference in her treatment was immediately apparent: professional, respectful, efficient. As she collected her belongings after screening, she noticed a familiar face, James Reynolds, now dressed in a community relations uniform, speaking with a group of new security officers. Their eyes met briefly, a moment of recognition passing between them. Reynolds hesitated, then approached her cautiously. Miss Williams, he said, the arrogance gone from his voice. I didn't expect to see you here. Officer Reynolds, she acknowledged, though I understand it's not officer anymore. No, he admitted. I'm in community relations now. Part of my job is training new staff on respectful engagement practices. The irony wasn't lost on either of them. How's that going for you? Vanessa asked, genuine curiosity in her voice. Reynolds considered the question carefully. It's enlightening. I've learned more in 6 months than in 15 years with a badge. He paused, gathering courage for what came next. Miss Williams, I never properly apologized for what happened. Not just for the arrest attempt, but for how I spoke to you, how I treated you. It was wrong on every level. Vanessa studied him, noting the changes 6 months had wrought, the humble demeanor, the absence of the swagger that had defined him before. Thank you for acknowledging that, she said finally. It matters. The Foundation's training program next week, Reynolds said hesitantly, on implicit bias in public spaces. I've signed up to attend. Vanessa nodded. I'll be leading part of that session. I look forward to your participation. As she walked away toward her gate, she passed the customer service desk where Jamie Ortiz, now wearing a supervisor's badge, greeted her warmly. Miss Williams, good to see you again. Your usual seat is ready, and Mr. Williams called to say he'll meet you in Paris this time. Thank you, Jamie, Vanessa replied with a genuine smile. How's the new position working out? Wonderful, Jamie beamed. The promotion came with tuition assistance. I'm starting night classes for my business degree next month. Excellent, Vanessa approved. The Foundation always needs good business minds. Keep in touch. As Vanessa boarded her flight, settling into her first-class seat without anyone questioning her presence there, she reflected on the journey of the past 6 months. One humiliating encounter had transformed not just airport security procedures, but sparked a national conversation about power, prejudice, and the selective application of respect. The system hadn't changed because of her status or her husband's influence alone. It had changed because they had used that influence strategically, demanding reforms that benefited everyone, not just those with connections or resources. As the plane taxied for takeoff, Vanessa looked out at the terminal building, now emblazoned with Skyline's new slogan, "Everyone deserves first-class respect." Officer Reynolds had learned that lesson the hard way, but thousands of travelers would benefit from the changes his mistake had set in motion. If you love this story, click on the like and subscribe button and share with others. See you in the next story.